Jason Williamson, Andrew Fearn, welcome. Sleaford Mods, of course. I want to start really about your backgrounds and the families that you were brought up in, and whether there was any cultural atmosphere where you could really envisage having a cultural output later in life.
Didn't really think about it. Was never politically conscious. Was never conscious of poetry. Was never conscious of well, you know, not a lot. You know what I mean? Right up until the last minute, I suppose. I don't know. You know, once you learn how to vocalize things, once you know, a lot of people don't connect themselves to the matters in hand. You know, life, society, the constraints of all that. But if you do, and you come from a background that is very much embedded in work, and very much embedded in working class culture, then you do marry the two together. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I completely understand that. I just come to Andrew though, because the background that I was brought up with, my father was a market trader, my mother was a nurse, and so they both would say to me, you know, you've got to get something where you earn money.
Yeah, I think quite across the board, you know, lots of people. I can remember at school having friends whose parents educated them at home. You know, they had like a parent who was a teacher or just educated them at home, you know, and they definitely had an advantage. And I think, you know, like Jason was saying, not knowing about poetry. I mean, I knew about things like that, but it didn't really make any sense to me. You know, I didn't really know. I didn't really grasp it. It wasn't until I left school that I started to educate myself that I really understood what English literature and the English language actually meant. You know, I think if you've only got, I mean, without you particularly gifted anyway, but, you know, most kids growing up in the 80s that didn't have academic parents, my dad's quite dyslexic. You know, he's a plant hire business that he's been successful at, but he's basically used his hands and worked hard to achieve money, you know, and you don't what am I trying to say? It's you just don't understand what's education, you know. You don't have that connection with it until you make that connection yourself. School never gave me that connection with English literature. We had terrible teachers for English at school.
Oh God, yeah.
Yeah. And same for history. I'd say the same about history. It wasn't until I left school that I thought, oh, history's actually quite interesting.
Well, they just teach you the same old shit, don't they? You know, it's not really proper history. It's just their account of a nice gentrified English history, isn't it? You know,
and they just seemed like they didn't enjoy teaching it either. You know.
No.
So, what music were you brought up around, Andrew? What did your parents play at home?
Well, my mum was quite into music generally, you know, but just the obvious sort of commercial end of the Beatles, Elvis, a lot of rock and roll stuff, you know. But then as I grow up, I used to see albums on TV, like K-Tel albums and compilations, even when I was really young, and I'd just stick them in my mum's trolley when we go to Asda. And she would kind of want the record as well, you know, and that was it really. There wasn't really any particular family member that was really into music.
What about you, Jason?
Just like TV, really. Top of the Pops when I was a kid, like 8 or 9, and the kind of records your dad played, and just like looking at pop stars on Saturday morning kids programs as well. And then
things up, don't you?
Yeah, you just pick it up, and then around 10 years of age, properly got into, you know, punk, Sex Pistols and stuff. Was introduced to that by my stepbrother's vast record collection of punk and new wave punk. By then it was new wave. There was a second wave of punk with the Exploited, GBH, all that business. You know what I mean? So yeah, I got interested that way, but again, didn't really connect that with anything socio-political. Do you know what I mean? Just too young, And I think you don't really start looking at it until you start suffering, which is usually from around 21. When you're thrust into, at 16, 17, I went to work. So it was like a wake-up call. But I consider that to be like earning my common sense stripes, being able to do practical work fast, under a lot of pressure, and working with a bunch of fucking savages, basically, yeah. So it took a while. Nobody gives a fuck about politics down there, do they? Down in the lower ebbs of society. Not a lot of people do, which is why they are thrown around so much by those at the top.
The 90s was people were just drunk, stoned.
Yeah, that was again. It was.
I used to know a bunch of people that lived at 9 Ladies Stone Circle, which is it's in Derbyshire, on a bus. And like there was one guy that used to wear a dress and they just taking mushrooms up there every day. They just lived up there for like 4 months. And we go and visit, and that's kind of the sort of thing that you would.
Yeah.
I used to know Pitch Shifter. I used to go around to their house and sit in their room while they were jamming, and they're just a bunch of crusty stoners. You know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah.
Different work.
You had it good round there. I think I should have done that rather than hang around pretentious clothes shops taking cocaine.
Yeah.